My grandfather never told my father the rule, and my father never told us because by the time we were old enough to understand it, he had already decided the rule was embarrassing, a superstition, the kind of thing old farmers believe because they didn't know any better. I'm going to tell you what the rule was and what happened when my brother Wade decided it didn't apply to him. And I want you to understand something before I get into it. I'm not a superstitious person. I wasn't raised religious. I've never owned a dream catcher or asked a psychic anything or watched ghost hunting shows with a straight face. I farm, I fix equipment, I do math in my head about soil moisture and seed costs, and whether a wet spring is going to wipe out a quarter of my income. That's who I'm talking to you as. So, when I tell you what I know, I need you to hear it from that person, not from someone who already believed. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from, and if you've had an encounter like this. The farm is in Barron County, Wisconsin, about 14 miles northwest of Rice Lake, which is a real town with a quick trip and a Culver's and a high school that has a decent wrestling program. I tell you this because people sometimes think, when you say farm in the North Woods, you mean some remote homestead nobody could find on a map. This farm is a 10-minute drive from a gas station. There are paved roads nearby. People live there, real people with real lives and normal problems. The property is 340 acres. My grandfather Alton Muse bought the north 160 in 1961, added the remaining 180 in 1974, when the Eckert family sold after old Carl Eckert had a bad fall and couldn't work the land anymore. The east half is tillable, corn and soybeans mostly, some rye, some alfalfa depending on the year. The west half is wooded, dense mixed forest, birch and maple, mostly in the upland sections, then black spruce and tamarack as you drop toward the wetland in the northwest corner. There's a creek running through it, Tanner Creek, which flows north and eventually drains into a small, unnamed lake about 3 miles away. The wetland is maybe 40 acres. The rest is forest on glacial till, uneven, rocky in places, and dense enough that in summer you lose visibility at about 30 yards. The topography matters here. The west half isn't flat. It rises and drops in the way that glaciated land in north-central Wisconsin does. Moraines left behind when the Laurentide ice sheet retreated about 10,000 years ago. You get ridges of gravel and sand running northeast to southwest, kettle depressions between them that hold water in spring. There's a bench about 2/3 of the way into the west woods, where the ridge flattens for maybe 3 acres before dropping again. And that bench is the reason Wade wanted a deer stand there. It's the kind of topographic feature that concentrates deer movement. Any experienced hunter would have spotted it on a topo map. My grandfather farmed the east half and left the west half alone. Not because it wasn't worth anything. There's good timber on it, mostly sugar maple and yellow birch, and the DNR would estimate the woodlot at somewhere around 6,000 board feet of merchantable timber if you had it assessed, which is real money. He left it alone because of the rule. The rule was this: nothing goes into the west woods after dark. Nobody crosses the fence line at the western edge of the tillable fields once the sun goes down. And in exchange, nothing comes out. He didn't explain it beyond that. At least not to my father, who told me this much when I was around 12, sitting in the pickup waiting for a grain truck that was running late. A gray August afternoon, misting, the kind of day where you can smell the creek from the road. He said it the way you'd relay a piece of equipment quirk, matter of fact, slightly dismissive, like he was informing me that the North Field's tile drainage backs up when we get more than 2 inches in a week and you just have to know that. He said his father kept the rule, and that his grandfather had kept it before that. He said he kept it himself, not because he believed in anything, but because it was what you did on this land, and habits that don't cost you anything are worth keeping. I remember the exact day because of the grain truck. Mitch Tolbert was driving it, and Mitch was always late, and my father had a particular kind of patience for Mitch that he didn't extend to most people, because Mitch had once helped him pull a tractor out of a ditch at 2 a.m. without being asked. That's the kind of accounting my father kept. Anyway, we sat in that pickup for about 40 minutes waiting, and the conversation drifted in and out of things. The price of corn, whether the North Field needed lime, whether Wade was going to stick with baseball that fall or switch to football like he'd been threatening. And somewhere in the middle of all that, casual as telling me that the North Gate drags, he said, Alton kept the West Woods off limits after dark, and his father did before him, and I do the same. Don't go in there at night. Don't send anyone in there at night. Nobody crosses that fence once the sun's down. That's the rule. I said, why? He was quiet for maybe 5 seconds, which was a long time for him. Then he said, because Alton said so, and Alton didn't say things without a reason. My grandfather Alton Mewis was not a talkative man. I knew him until I was 21, when he died of a heart attack at his kitchen table one November morning, with his coffee going cold beside him. He was 74. He'd farmed this land for 30 years by then, and he looked like someone had carved him out of it, thick through the chest and shoulders, even at 74. Hands that had the permanent shape of work, face weathered to a specific brown that didn't look like skin anymore, just another material the land had produced. He spoke in short sentences with long pauses between them, and you learned early not to fill the pauses, because if you waited, he'd usually add something important. The thing I know about Alton and the West Woods comes mostly from what I observed directly across the years. I was old enough to pay attention, because he didn't discuss it. He maintained the fence line at the west edge of the tillable ground, with more consistent attention than any other fence on the property. The south fence got repaired when it needed it. The north fence got repaired when it needed it. The east fence was standard maintenance. But the west fence, the one that ran the length of the boundary between the east pasture and the tree line, he walked every week from May to November, and he repaired any damage within 24 hours, regardless of what else was pressing. I watched him leave the seat of a tractor in the middle of a planting day once, when he noticed from the field that a post on the west fence had gone over, and he went and fixed it before he went back to planting. That's not the behavior of a man who keeps the fence for livestock containment. That's the behavior of a man who understands the fence as something else entirely and keeps it accordingly. He also, and I only noticed this after I was an adult looking back, never spoke about the West Woods in terms of resource. He never said the timber's coming along, or we ought to log that off someday, or that's good ground under those trees, if you ever cleared it. Every other part of the farm he'd discuss in terms of yield and potential and what could be done with it. The West Woods he didn't discuss at all, except once. I was maybe 14, and I'd asked him why we didn't keep a woodlot like the Habermans, who cut their back 40 every 15 years on rotation and sold the logs, and it was reliable income. He looked at me for a long moment in that way he had, the measuring pause. And then he said, "Some land isn't yours to use. It's just yours to keep." I didn't understand it then. I think about it all the time now.
Quick thing before we move on. I have this book coming out. It's called the Dogman Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. Been working on it for a long time. So if you want to check that out, links down below. Now let's get you back to the video.
The other thing I know about Alton and the West Woods, he had a neighbor for 9 years named Rolf Karjala, Finnish, who farmed the section directly west, the section on the other side of the West Woods, which means Rolf's east field bordered Alton's west tree line from the opposite side. Rolf and Alton were friendly in the way that rural neighbors in those years were friendly. Not close, not social, but respectful, exchanging equipment and labor at busy times, checking on each other after hard winters. My father told me once that Rolf had sold his property in 1970 and moved his family to Minnesota, which struck people as strange because his family had been in Barron County since before the First World War. My father didn't know why Rolf left. Alton knew, or knew something about it, but never said. What my father told me was that in the year before Rolf sold, he and Alton had had a long conversation at Rolf's kitchen table that my father had witnessed from the next room, too young to follow, but old enough to know from the tone that it was serious. He said the conversation lasted about 2 hours, and at the end of it, Rolf had looked like a man who had just been handed a heavy thing he didn't want to carry. And then Alton had driven home without saying anything else about it. I think Rolf had done something wrong. I think he'd violated the boundary from his side, whatever the equivalent on his property of going into the West Woods at night was. And Alton had understood it through changes in the property the same way I understood the cattle and the cats and the sound in the field in 2021. I think Alton told Rolf what he knew, and I think Rolf decided he'd rather sell and move than live with what he was now carrying. That's a completely reasonable decision. I might have made the same decision if I'd been in his position and didn't have this land in my bones, but I can't know any of that for certain. What I know is that Rolf left and Alton stayed, and Alton kept the rule for another 12 years after that conversation, until his heart gave out at his kitchen table. And in all those years, whatever is in the West Woods stayed in the West Woods, and the farm was good. He died in 2018, tractor rollover on the south slope, winter, ice under the snow. He was 63. I was 41. Wade was 38. We inherited the land equally, 170 acres each on paper. And for the first 2 years, we ran it together the way we'd been running it alongside Dad since we were teenagers. Same arrangements, same boundaries. Nobody in the West Woods after dark. I want to tell you something about growing up on this land before I get into what happened with Wade, because I think the shape of a person's relationship to a piece of ground matters, and mine is different from Wade's, and I think that difference is part of why we ended up on opposite sides of this. I was the one who stayed. I don't mean that as a complaint about Wade. He farmed, he was good at it, he came back to the property every day of his adult life. But there's a difference between staying on a piece of land and living inside it, and from the time I was maybe 8 or 9 years old, I was inside this land in a way Wade never quite was. I walked every fence line. I knew where the tile lines ran by feel, by the way the ground sounded different underfoot in a wet spring, by which rows of corn stayed yellow a week longer than the rest when the season was dry. I knew where the deer bedded in the east woodlot, and where the coyotes denned in the brush pile on the south fence, and where the great horned owls nested in the big dead elm on the north headland that eventually came down in an ice storm in 2009. I also knew the West Woods, or knew them from the outside the way, the shape of something you've never been allowed to touch. I walked the east fence line, the fence between the tillable east half and the wooded west half, hundreds of times across 30 years. I learned that fence the way you learn a familiar face. Every post, every splice, every section, where the ground dipped and the wire wanted to sag. I learned where the deer crossed at night, by the wear on the wire and the tracks in the mud under it. I learned which trees on the west side came down in bad storms, by the changed light on the tree line in the morning after. I learned the smell of the West Woods from the fence line. In summer, it's different from the east woodlot, denser, cooler at the base, with a muskeg quality from the wetland in the northwest corner that carries on the right wind all the way to the fence. In fall, it's wood rot and wet leaves, and occasionally, when the air is very still and the temperature is dropping fast in the evening, something else underneath those smells that I've never been able to identify. Not decay, not animal, not fungal. Something organic and old that doesn't have a name in my experience. I noticed it first when I was maybe 16, and I noticed it every fall after that, and I never found an explanation for it. And by the time I was an adult, I'd stopped looking for one and just treated it as the smell of the West Woods in October. And I learned, gradually, without anyone ever teaching me directly, that the west tree line had a quality that the east woodlot didn't. The east woodlot was just woods. You could go in there in June and find morels, and in fall you could follow a deer trail, and in winter you could check the rabbit snares my grandfather had kept in the brushy south end of it. The east woodlot was ours in the way that tillable land is yours. You could work it, you could use it, it gave back what you put into it. The west woods were different. Even in broad daylight, standing at the fence looking in, there was a quality to the air on that side that was harder to name. Not menace exactly, more like the feeling you get standing at the edge of a drop you can't see the bottom of. The awareness of depth without knowing the dimensions of what you were looking at. In summer, when the canopy was full and the undergrowth was thick, the forest on the west side was dark enough that visibility dropped within about 20 feet of the fence line, and that darkness had a weight to it that the east woodlot's darkness didn't. I went in there twice in my life before any of this started. Once at age 15, in full daylight, to find a calf that had gotten through the fence. I found the calf about 100 yards in, spooked and unhurt, and I got us both out in under 20 minutes, and I didn't linger, and I didn't go back for years. Once at age 30, in the late afternoon, chasing a fence line to find where the wire had been cut, it turned out to be copper thieves working the county that season, and they'd gotten through our west fence trying to reach the transformer on the power line that ran through the northwest corner. I found the cut, I verified the transformer was untouched, and I was back on the east side of the fence in less than 10 minutes. Both times, I felt the same thing. Not fear, or not what I'd call fear in the way most people use that word. It was more like standing in a room where the air pressure is slightly wrong. A physical register, body level, below the threshold of conscious identification. The kind of thing that makes you breathe differently without deciding to. A sense of being a guest in something that doesn't organize itself around human convenience, or human categories, or human timelines. Very old, very present, not hostile but not accommodating either. Just there, doing what it does, and aware of me the way I was aware of it. I never told my father about it. I didn't have the language for it, and I wasn't sure it wasn't just me. Some people are more attuned to place than others. Some people feel things in old buildings or in certain stretches of road, or in particular rooms that other people in the same space don't register at all. I'd always assumed I was that kind of person about a lot of things, and I'd learned to discount it when the rational explanation was available. The rational explanation for the West Woods was always available. Dense, old-growth mixed forest with limited human presence generates its own ecosystem, and that ecosystem sounds and feels different from managed land. Animals avoid certain areas for reasons we don't always understand. The glacial terrain of the West half-created microclimates, lower temperatures in the Kettle depressions, different humidity levels, different soil composition that would affect how the air moved and smelled and felt. All of that is real, and all of it was available to me as an explanation. Wade took the explanation and ran with it. I held the explanation and kept watching. The difference between us, I think, was that I'd grown up standing at that fence line and carrying that feeling for 30 years. And somewhere in those 30 years, it had graduated from a thing I explained away to a thing I held alongside the explanation without resolving either. Wade had always been less comfortable with the unresolved. He needed things to land somewhere. And a rule with no explanation that costs you the use of a section of ground with good timber and better deer pressure is the kind of thing that, if you need it to land somewhere, eventually lands in the category of superstition that doesn't apply to you. In the spring of 2021, Wade decided he wanted to put a deer stand in the West Woods. I want to be careful here, because I don't want to make Wade sound stupid or careless. He's not. He's a good farmer, practical, attentive to detail, the kind of guy who reads the Extension Service bulletins on soybean cyst, nematode, and actually implements what he learns. He's also 3 inches taller than me and considerably louder. And in family decisions, he'd always had a way of starting from the assumption that his instincts were correct and then building toward a justification. The deer stand idea came out of that mode. He'd decided, and then he reasoned backward from the decision to something that sounded like logic. The West Woods had good deer. We both knew that. We saw them on the field edges at dusk, big-bodied whitetails working the corn stubble, does with fawns in June at the tree line, occasionally a shooter buck in velvet at last light that would make any hunter look twice. Wade had gotten a decent 8-pointer on the east field 3 years running, but wanted something bigger. And the kind of bucks that go heavy come from the interior timber, not the field edges. He'd talked himself into the West Woods over the course of a winter, and by March he'd already picked the spot on a topo map. That bench 2/3 of the way in, overlooking the flat ground where deer would naturally stage before moving to the fields. I told him about the rule. He'd heard it the same time I had, from the same source. He waved it off. "Dad's gone," he said, and Dad didn't really believe it either. He just did it out of habit. I said maybe. But it's a habit that goes back far enough that I think it's worth asking why. He said he'd be in and out before dark. He said he was putting the stand in during daylight and hunting it at morning first light, and by the time dark hit, he'd be out. I said that wasn't the same thing, and he said he thought I was overthinking it. I didn't push. Wade and I had the kind of relationship where direct confrontation never went well. He had a way of digging in when he felt pressured that made everything harder, and I'd learned over 40 years that the times I'd had any effect on him were the times I'd said my piece once and then let him carry it. So I let it sit, and he put his stand in over a weekend in late April, 2 trees and a twin-trunk maple, solid platform with a clear shooting lane looking northeast toward the bench. I want to describe what the weekend of stand installation looked like, because I was aware of it even though I wasn't there. Wade told me about it afterward, piece by piece, over the next 2 years as things escalated and he started filling in the gaps he'd originally left out. The complete version of what he experienced that weekend took over a year to assemble. He went in Saturday morning around 9, full daylight, carrying the platform sections and the climbing sticks and his tools. He had a ground pack with him, his bow pack converted to hauling gear, and he made 2 trips in because the platform sections were heavy. He said the first trip felt normal. The spring woods in Barron County in late April have a particular character. The birches are just starting to bud, the ground is soft and dark with snowmelt. The woodcock are moving through, and you can hear them in the thickets, that strange nasal painting sound they make before the sky dance. He said there were woodcock in the tamarack edge at the south end of the property. He said the light was nice coming through the bare canopy, and he felt fine, and the woods felt like just woods. He said the second trip was different. He couldn't put it into specific terms when he told me. He said the woods got quieter, not dramatic, not all at once, just gradually quieter over about 20 minutes. The way a room empties without you noticing until you look up and everyone is gone. The woodcock stopped. A pair of ravens that had been moving through the canopy up ahead went silent. Even the creek noise dropped, which shouldn't happen. A creek doesn't get quieter because the ambient woodland sounds stop. But that's what he said. He said at one point he stopped walking and just stood still for a minute and listened, and the woods around him were as quiet as he'd ever heard woods be in April, which is not how April woods are supposed to sound. He said he felt like something was watching him, and he dismissed it as the isolation effect, the way your brain amplifies small stimuli when you're alone in a large quiet space. And he kept going. He found the bench. He set the stand. He was out by noon, and he drove home and ate lunch and felt fine and didn't call me about it. He felt fine, he said, until about 2 in the afternoon when the feeling caught up with him. A delayed reaction, a physical sense of having been too close to something, and only now starting to register it at the body level. He said it felt like the way you feel a few hours after a near miss on the road. The adrenaline finally arriving after the danger had passed, retroactive, doing no good. He went to bed early that Saturday and slept heavily and didn't go back in on Sunday. What he didn't tell me until much later, not until the fall when things had gotten bad enough that he was telling me everything, was that on the drive out on Saturday, coming down the gravel track that runs along the south edge of the property toward the county road, he'd stopped the truck because something was on the track ahead of him. He said he thought at first it was a dog, one of the neighbor's labs that ran loose sometimes. He pulled up to maybe 30 yards from it, and it still hadn't moved. And in the truck's headlights, and he'd turned the headlights on because the tree canopy over the track made it dim even in late morning, he could see that it was not a dog. He said it was standing in the track facing his truck, and it was very large, and the head was wrong. Wrong in a way he couldn't immediately categorize, because the shape was in that gap between categories that the brain resists, where you keep searching for the right file and not finding it. And then it stepped off the track to the left, down into the drainage ditch, and was gone. He said it moved the way nothing he'd seen moved. Not wrong, not unnatural, just very fast and very controlled. The way a person moves when they know exactly where they're going and have no reason to hesitate. Into the ditch, and then through the brush on the far side, and then the brush stopped moving, and there was nothing there. He drove home and didn't think about it too hard, he said, or he tried not to. He was good at not thinking about things too hard when the thing was going to complicate a decision he'd already made. Wade had always had that capacity. I used to admire it as pragmatism. By the fall of 2021, I'd revised my opinion. What happened next didn't happen immediately. There was a gap, a delay of maybe 6 weeks. And I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out whether that gap means the two things aren't connected, or whether it just means something was patient. The first thing that changed was the livestock. We run a small cow-calf operation on the east side, 35 head, nothing huge, the kind of scale that makes sense when you're also running row crop and doing it without hired help. In late May, 3 of the cows stopped going to the west end of the east pasture. There's a water tank at the west end, and the cows would normally rotate through it daily, morning and evening, with more traffic and afternoon heat. For about a week and a half, they clustered at the east tank and just didn't move. Not 3 of them, all 35. I noticed it because the east tank was getting drawn down faster than usual, and I thought we had a float problem. When I went out to check, all 35 animals were stacked up around it, and the west end of the pasture was empty. Clear sky, mild weather, no obvious stressor I could identify. The water level at the west tank was almost full, meaning nothing had drunk from it in at least 2 days. I walked the west end of the pasture. The cattle watched me cross from the east end in a way that felt, and I know this is a strange word for it, coordinated, like they'd agreed on something between themselves that I hadn't been told about. I checked the fence line along the west tree line and found nothing. No coyote sign, no disturbance, no reason for 35 cows to cluster at one end of a pasture in mild weather. I walked back, and the cattle watched me return, and still didn't move. That same week, the barn cats disappeared. We had 4 of them. 2 tabbies, and 2 that were some indeterminate orange and white combination that barn cats converge on when you don't intervene in their social arrangements. They had been on the property for years. Barn cats in rural Wisconsin are not exactly coddled animals, but ours had established routines: morning feeding near the equipment shed, evening hang around the milk house door, where there was a heat duct near ground level. One morning, there were 4 cats, and 2 days later, there were none. I walked the property. I found nothing, not a feather, not a tuft of fur. Wade noticed the cats when he came over to borrow a cultivator's sweep, and I mentioned it. He said something probably got them: an owl, a coyote, the usual attrition of outdoor cats on a farm, which is true. That does happen. But not all 4 at once, and not without leaving anything behind. I've thought about the cats a lot in the years since, more than you'd think a person would think about 4 barn cats. What bothers me isn't their disappearance. Animals disappear. That's a fact of farm life, and you learn not to attach too hard to anything that lives outside. What bothers me is the completeness of it. No trace means one of 2 things. Either whatever took them consumed them entirely, which would require something large and thorough and operating multiple times in a short window, or they weren't taken at all. They left. Something changed in the environment of the farmstead that was enough to cause 4 cats that had lived in one place for years to move. Permanently, apparently, because none of them ever came back and none of them turned up at any neighboring property. Cats don't do that unless something has changed in a way that crosses a threshold they have no tolerance for. They're territorial in the way that working animals get territorial. They know their range, they know where the food comes from, they know the shelter. You don't displace a barn cat from its territory with minor disturbance. You displace it by making the territory intolerable. Whatever had moved in the West Woods in the weeks after Wade put that stand in had apparently done exactly that. Made the west side of the farmstead intolerable for 4 animals that weren't going to wait around and see how it developed. I didn't put that together until months later. At the time, I accepted Wade's explanation because it was available and because I needed the available explanation, but I filed it. That's the thing about farming. You notice anomalies and you file them even when you're not ready to do anything with them. The float in the west tank running dry, 35 cows that wouldn't cross a pasture, 4 cats that evaporated overnight. Each one had an explanation. Together, they had a shape. The second week of June, I was in the east field just before sundown, finishing up a pass with the cultivator on the north end. The machine was loud and I had the radio going, so my awareness of what was around me was low. I came around the north headland and killed the engine to check the coulter adjustment, and in the silence after the tractor went quiet, I heard something. It was coming from the tree line, the west tree line, about 200 yards away across the field. I don't have a good way to describe it except to say it was vocal. Not an animal sound I recognized, and I've been around livestock and wildlife my whole life. Not a coyote, which I know the way I know the sound of my own name. Not a deer blowing, not an owl, not anything my brain could file naturally. It was low, carrying, with a quality like 2 sounds happening at once. The main sound and something underneath it. A resonance that settled somewhere between my back teeth and my collarbone before I consciously registered I was hearing anything. The kind of thing that makes the back of your neck do something before your brain has processed what your ears picked up. I sat on the tractor for probably 30 seconds just listening. The sound didn't repeat. The field was quiet the way fields go quiet when something's changed, that particular absence of ambient insect noise and wind that happens sometimes before a storm. Except the sky was clear and there was no weather coming. I drove back to the farmstead faster than I needed to. I didn't say anything to Wade for 3 days. Then I did, and I laid it out. The cattle, the cats, the sound at the tree line. And I said I thought we should talk about the stand. He listened. He said the cattle thing was probably behavioral clustering, which does happen. He said the cats probably got taken by a great horned owl or a coyote, also rational. He said the sound was me being suggestible because I already had the rule in my head. And here's the thing, he wasn't entirely wrong. That's what makes this hard to tell. Every single thing I'd observed had a rational explanation. Not a great one in some cases, but one that existed. I couldn't point to anything definitive. I just had the feeling, which is not evidence. The feeling wasn't new. I'd been carrying a version of it since April, since the weekend Wade put the stand in, though I didn't know then that he'd seen something on the drive out. There was a change in the quality of the property that I didn't have a clean word for. The best I can say is that the west side of the farm felt more present, like something that had been content to stay in the background had moved a step closer. Not threatening, not obviously different, just closer. The way a sound you'd been tuning out slowly gets louder until you can't tune it out anymore, except there was no actual sound. Just an increased sense of something there. I've talked to a few other people over the years who have had encounters. Not many, because this is not something you bring up in most contexts, but a few, found through the kind of oblique conversation that happens when two people are talking around the edges of something they both know, but neither has said directly. What I've noticed across those conversations is that the feeling of something more present is described consistently and described the same way. Not a sense of being threatened, but a sense of being noticed. A shift from not registering on whatever awareness exists on the other side of the line to registering on it. Whether that registration is caused by the violation, the stand going in, the wrong movement at the wrong time, or whether the violation is what makes you pay enough attention to notice the registration that was already there, I can't say with certainty, but the feeling is real and it's recognizable, and I've heard it described independently by people who had no contact with each other and no shared vocabulary for it. That's worth something, even if I can't tell you exactly what. I want to tell you about the Book of Enoch here because it matters to where this is going, and because when I finally started looking into what I was seeing, this is where I ended up. The Book of Enoch is not part of the standard biblical canon in most Christian traditions. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church still uses it as canonical scripture. The Dead Sea Scrolls found at Qumran in 1947 contained fragments of it, including Aramaic portions dating to at least the 2nd century BCE, which is one of the oldest surviving manuscript traditions for any text from that era. The Qumran fragments are in the collection of the Israel Antiquities Authority and have been studied extensively. I'm not a theologian. I'm telling you what I found when I started reading. The text describes beings called the Watchers, sometimes rendered as Grigori from the Greek, from the root meaning to watch or to be awake. The Watchers are described as entities assigned to observe humanity. The word used implies a sustained, active attention, not a passive awareness. They are described as descending, as interacting with the natural world, as taking forms that blur the line between what's natural and what isn't. The language used for some of them in the older Aramaic fragments is closer to the ones who walk between than the polished translation most people encounter. The physical descriptions, and I'm paraphrasing from scholarly translations, include height that exceeds normal human proportion, a form that blends traits associated with large predators and human intelligence, and eyes described as knowing, as seeing through in a way that ordinary sight doesn't. The Book of Enoch isn't the only ancient text with these descriptions. Sumerian cylinder seals from the 3rd millennium BCE depict hybrid beings, canid heads on upright bipedal forms, in contexts that suggest guardianship, boundary keeping, threshold watching. The Egyptian Anubis tradition is the most famous version of this, but it's not unique to Egypt. Canaanite texts, Akkadian texts, Hurrian ritual texts, the same figure keeps showing up. The thing with the animal head and the upright stance and the function of watching a boundary between territories, between the known and the unknown. I don't think this is coincidence. I think it's a record. I think people across cultures and across a very long stretch of time kept encountering the same thing and writing down what they saw in whatever framework they had available. The Ojibwe oral traditions, and I say this with some care, because I'm not Ojibwe and I'm reporting secondhand from academic sources, not claiming authority over a tradition that isn't mine, describe forest beings that are not animal and not human, and that watch the boundaries of the natural world and the territories of people. The structural description is consistent with what shows up in the Enoch texts and in the Mesopotamian sources. Something old, something territorial, something that has been part of the landscape long before the people currently living on it arrived. Something that has arrangements with the people who pay attention and consequences for the people who don't. Barron County, where my family's land sits, was Ojibwe territory before European settlement. I'm not saying the thing in my West Woods is a spirit in any traditional religious sense. I'm saying that multiple independent cultural traditions, developed over thousands of years on different continents, have arrived at descriptions that match what I've seen in a way I can't account for by coincidence. Whatever these things are, they've been here long enough that people in a lot of different times and places noticed them and made sense of them as best they could. What I know about Dogman, not from books or YouTube, but from what I've seen and pieced together over 4 years of watching the West Woods, is this. It's not a bear. I know what a bear looks like at any distance, standing or otherwise. And so does anyone who's spent serious time outdoors in a part of the country that has bears. Black bears in Wisconsin are common enough that I've had them in my cornfield twice, and I know what they look like on their hind legs, the shape of the spine, the way the head sits, the profile. This is not that. It's not misidentified wildlife, not a deer standing weird, not an elk, not a wolf, not any combination of those things seen in bad light. It's not a person in a suit. It is a large bipedal animal with a canid head, elongated muzzle, high-set ears, a neck that connects to the shoulders differently than any quadruped I've ever seen, that stands somewhere between 7 and 8 feet tall when fully upright and moves between bipedal and quadrupedal gaits in a way that should not be mechanically possible for something that size without a skeletal arrangement that zoology doesn't account for. I have seen it 4 times. I'll tell you about each one. The first time was July 9th, 2021. I know the date because I wrote it down that night, while everything was still present, before sleep had a chance to soften the edges. I was checking fence on the west side of the east pasture, the fence line that borders the tree line of the west woods. Evening, maybe 2 hours before dark, the light slanting from the northwest, long golden shadows off the field corn. I was working south along the posts, staple hammer in my hand, checking tension, and I came to a section that had been pressed outward, not broken. Pressed, like something heavy had leaned against it from the wood side. The top 2 strands of wire were bowed out maybe 8 inches beyond their normal plane. The staples on both posts were pulled, but still seated. Whatever had pressed the fence had done it from the tree's side, pushing west to east, and had then removed itself without pulling the wire loose. I stood there looking at it for a minute, working out the mechanics. To press wire from the west side and bow it 8 inches east without snapping the staples or breaking the wire, you'd need to apply a large, flat force, not a sharp one. A deer hitting the fence at speed leaves a broken or bent staple and usually tears the wire or leaves hair. A bear pressing under a fence leaves low-height disturbance and paw impressions in the soil. This was mid-height, high on the wire, and the ground at the post bases on the west side showed no impression that I could read. The force came from something that leaned rather than struck, and it came from something that could reach high on the fence without putting significant weight on the ground directly below. I was looking at the fence and trying to figure out what had done it when I looked up and it was just there. It was standing inside the tree line, partially behind a large maple, and it wasn't trying to hide. That's the thing I keep coming back to. It wasn't concealing itself. It was standing in a position that partially occluded it from view. The trunk of the maple blocked its left shoulder and part of its torso, but its head was fully visible, and it was looking at me with complete directness. No furtiveness, no nervousness, nothing that resembled how a wild animal acts when it encounters a human unexpectedly. It was looking at me the way you'd look at someone who just walked onto your property and you were deciding whether to say something or let them go. I didn't move. I've heard people describe freezing in these situations and always assumed it was adrenaline lock, involuntary. This wasn't. I made a conscious choice not to move because moving felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. Like when you're near something with a strong electromagnetic field and every instinct tells you not to touch it, even though nothing is overtly dangerous. We looked at each other for what I think was about 15 seconds, long in that context. Long enough that I could see details. It was dark in color, the fur a very deep brown that looked black in the shadows at the tree line. The head was large, proportionally larger than even a big canid. A wolf's head already looks oversized on a wolf's body, and this was beyond that. In the way the proportions of some animals look wrong when you see them at a scale that evolution wasn't optimizing for. The muzzle was long and tapered and this is the part I've had the hardest time putting into words. The face was doing something with its expression. Not an animal face processing stimulus. A face that was making a decision. The height. I want to address the height, because it's the thing most people push back on when I describe this. And I understand why. 7 to 8 feet is outside the range of any known canid, obviously, and also outside the range of any known primate. And it's at the extreme upper end of what a very large bear would reach on its hind legs. But I know what 7 feet looks like because I've stood next to enough barbed wire fence in my life to use it as a reference, and the fence I was standing at is exactly 54 inches, 4.5 feet, from the ground to the top strand. The head of what I was looking at was substantially above the fence line. If the fence is at my chest, the fence was at maybe its midsection. That's not ambiguous, and it's not a trick of perception. The scale was what it was. Then it stepped back, not turned and ran. Step back, 1 step, 2, and the shadows took it. The maple was there. The fence was there with its pressed wire. The field was there in the long evening light. Nothing else. I went back to the farmhouse and I wrote down the date, the time, the location, and a physical description as best I could manage. I still have that notebook. I've added to it after every subsequent encounter, and it's the most honest document I have of all of this. More honest than what I'm telling you now, because the notebook entries were written in the immediate aftermath, when I couldn't yet shape them into a narrative someone else could follow. What I wrote that night was rougher than what I've told you here. The descriptions were fragmented, the way writing is when you're trying to get it down before the edges soften. I wrote the height estimate with 3 different references. Fence wire at 54 inches, the third fence post at 62 inches, the maple trunk diameter as a width comparison. I wrote the color twice using 2 different words and crossed one out. I wrote about the expression and then scratched it out and then wrote it again in slightly different language, as if changing the phrasing would make it feel less impossible to have seen. What I couldn't write was the quality of the attention. I tried 4 times. It watched me. I crossed that out. It was aware of me in a way I can't explain. I crossed that out. The look was not animal. I kept that one and circled it, but I knew it wasn't right either. The problem with trying to describe being looked at by something that intelligent is that the language we have for it is built around human experience of being looked at by humans. When another person looks at you with full attention, there's a whole social context you're reading simultaneously. You know roughly what kind of looking it is. You can feel the register. You know if it's curiosity or suspicion or threat or something else. What I was on the receiving end of at the fence was full attention with no readable register. Not because it had no register, because the register was outside my reference points. Something was assessing me using criteria I couldn't access and reaching conclusions I couldn't read. That's what I kept returning to in the weeks after the first encounter, not the size, not the face. The fact that something had looked at me and formed a judgment about me and I had no idea what the judgment was. Whatever it decided when it stepped back into the shadows, I don't know. I just know it decided something, and that something determined the behavior that followed, which was, that night, to leave. Which meant I'd passed whatever assessment that was, at least for the moment. I called Wade that night, told him what I saw. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Okay, and what do you want to do?" I said I thought we should pull the stand. He said he'd think about it. He didn't pull it. The second time I saw it was in August, late August, hot and dry, drought stress showing in the rolled leaves on the field corn. I was coming back from the north end of the property after dark, later than I'd planned because a hydraulic line on the cultivator had given me trouble, and I'd been out there with a headlamp and a wrench longer than expected. The hydraulic line was on the folding section of the cultivator toolbar, a section I'd been meaning to replace for 2 seasons, and it had finally let go when I was about as far from the shop as I could be on the north end. I had a spare fitting in the toolbox, but the light was bad and the connection was awkward and it took me the better part of an hour. By the time I got back in the truck, it was well after 9 and the sky was full dark except in the west, where there was still a thin gray line at the horizon. I had the truck running without headlights for a stretch of the lane, because I know that road well enough, and I'd stopped at the top of the rise to check if there was any moisture in the night air, which is something I do out of habit. Just stand there and breathe, see if the dew point has come up. Late August in a dry year, you're watching for the dew point to climb, because when the nights start cooling down to dew point, that's when the drought stress can ease a little, when the corn that's been under stress can recover overnight and cob fill can improve. You stop a lot and breathe the night air. The west tree line was 100 yards off to my left. The tree line was black against a sky that still had some gray left in it, the first stars coming in the east. And against that gray strip of sky, at the exact place where the field meets the woods, something was standing. It was silhouetted. I couldn't see detail, just the shape, but the shape was enough. No tree trunk is that shape, no stump, no piece of farm equipment left in the field. Nothing that belongs in that landscape is that shape. The spine rises too high, the head sits wrong, The limbs hang wrong for anything that belongs in that tree line. 7 feet, maybe 8 feet, against the last of the western sky, standing still in a way that felt like it had been standing there for a while. It was standing at the field edge looking toward me, and I knew it had been there before I stopped, because there was nothing in how it held itself that suggested surprise or adjustment. It had watched me park and get out of the truck and stand there in the dark. The stillness of it was not the stillness of an animal that had frozen in response to detecting something. It was the stillness of something that had already detected me some time ago and had made the decision to be visible. I want to tell you what that distinction means, because I've thought about it a lot. When a deer spots you and freezes, the freeze has urgency in it. The muscles are cocked, the body is ready to move. There's a coiled quality even in the stillness. When a predator freezes to avoid detection, there's concealment in it, a deliberate management of movement and silhouette. What I was looking at had neither of those qualities. The stillness had patience in it. The posture communicated nothing that resembled threat or concealment or the management of detection. It communicated presence. Here I am. Here you are. I stood there for maybe 20 seconds, long enough to be sure of what I was seeing, long enough for the recognition to finish arriving at the level where the body responds, which for me was a cold feeling in the stomach that had nothing to do with the temperature. Then I got back in the truck and drove back to the farmstead. I didn't write this one down until the following morning, because that night I couldn't sit still long enough to write. I walked the house twice. I checked that the doors were locked. I stood at the kitchen window looking at nothing for a while, and then I went to bed and lay there until about 2 in the morning when I finally slept. What I've thought about since is how the 2 sightings were positioned in relation to what Wade was or wasn't doing. The first one came to the fence line, to the pressed wire, as if checking on what I'd found. The second one stood in the open at the field edge, watching from a distance after I'd told Wade, and he'd said he'd think about pulling the stand and done nothing. The first felt like an observation. The second felt like a communication, something registering that the correction hadn't happened. The week after the second sighting, the wetland section of the West Woods went quiet at night. Not a gradual tapering. Frogs don't just stop because a predator passes through. They pause and then resume. These stopped and didn't resume. 3 nights in a row, I stood on the back porch after dark and listened, and the west side of the property was silent in a way it hadn't been in any summer I could remember. The spring peepers had been heavy that year, in May, and by June there were wood frogs and chorus frogs working the wetland edge. And by late July, there should have been green frogs and bullfrogs along Tanner Creek. All of them just stopped. I mentioned it to my neighbor to the south, Carl Haberman, who farms about 200 acres adjacent to my south fence. He said he'd noticed it too. He said his dogs had been acting funny about that side of his property. I asked what funny meant, and he said they just didn't want to go over there. I didn't tell Carl any of this. He was not in any version of this story, and I wasn't going to put him in one. But I noted it, because it told me the area of effect was larger than my property line. Whatever was happening, it wasn't contained to the 340 acres my grandfather had bought. There's something I did in September of 2021 that I haven't told anyone before, and I'm going to tell it now, because I think it's part of the record and it changes how I understand the first sighting. I went to the fence line at dusk, deliberately, on purpose, knowing the timing, knowing what the rule was and what I was doing. I want to be clear that I wasn't crossing the fence. I wasn't going into the West Woods. I was going to stand at the fence line at the western edge of the east pasture in the last light and see what happened. I don't fully know what I expected. Maybe nothing. Maybe I was testing my own nerve. Maybe some part of me that I hadn't admitted to myself wanted direct contact, wanted to see if what I'd seen in July was repeatable, wanted to know if there was something there that could be communicated with. I drove the truck to the south end of the east pasture and walked north along the fence line in the early dusk, around 7 in the evening, the sky still pale in the southwest. I was carrying nothing except my notebook and a flashlight I'd decided not to use. I walked to the spot where the wire had been pressed in July, which I'd noted precisely in the notebook, 43 posts north from the corner post, and I stood there. I stood there for about 20 minutes. The West Woods in dusk in September are a specific thing. The understory is still full with leaves, and in the last light the canopy goes from green to something darker, and the shadows in the interior go from dim to opaque very fast. The temperature in the tree line is always a few degrees cooler than the open field, and you feel it standing at the fence. The air from the west side is colder, heavier, carrying the smell of the creek and the tamarack muskeg, and something underneath those smells that I'd come to think of as the particular signature of the West Woods, a smell I couldn't name that was always there. At about the 15-minute mark, I became aware that the smell had changed. The creek and muskeg baseline was still there, but something else had come into it, warmer, with a biological quality, the way a large animal smells when it's close and its body heat is carrying its scent toward you, the smell of something alive. I didn't hear movement, no footsteps, no brush displacement, nothing. The smell just arrived, and then, at the 18-minute mark or so, at the tree line about 30 feet north of where I was standing, something moved. Not dramatically, a shift in the shadow, the kind of movement that you register before you can articulate what you saw. And then stillness. I stood still too. My heart was going. Not panic, not fight or flight, just elevated. The way it goes when you're doing something that requires your full attention. Nothing else happened. After another 2 minutes, the smell faded. The tree line went back to being just a tree line. I waited a few more minutes and then I walked back to the truck and drove home. What I took from that is this. Whatever was happening in the West Woods could smell me at 30 feet through a fence, and it had chosen to stay back. The movement I saw was it repositioning to get a better angle on my scent, not approaching. It was interested in what I was doing, and it was being careful about it. That's not an animal response. An animal would either hold still or withdraw. The repositioning, the careful adjustment, the holding of distance, that's something making a considered decision about how close to get. I drove home that September evening and sat in the truck in my own driveway for about 5 minutes before I went inside. What I was feeling wasn't fear. It was closer to the feeling you get after a conversation that went further than you expected. That slightly breathless sense of having been in contact with something larger than the context you thought you were in. I'd gone to the fence to test whether the rule was two-directional, whether not crossing produced a response. It did. It went to the fence because I went to the fence. That was enough to tell me what I needed to know. I didn't go back to the fence at dusk after that. I kept my distance. But I kept the distance as acknowledgement, not as avoidance. There's a difference, and I think the thing in the West Woods registers the difference, and I think that difference is part of why the arrangement on my side of the fence has held across 30 years of me being on this land. I've since looked at a few things in the county's historical record that I want to mention, because they bear on whether any of this can be verified in any external way. Barron County has a small local history archive maintained by the County Historical Society out of Rice Lake. I spent a Saturday there, in the winter of 2023, reading through the logging-era records. The West Woods of this farm were logged once, around 1908 to 1910, by a company out of Chippewa Falls. The logging records are incomplete, but there's a company foreman's report in the archive from the summer of 1909 that mentions in passing that the crew working the northwest section of the tract, which would have been approximately what is now the western half of our property, had persistent problems with men refusing to work the evening shift. The report doesn't elaborate on what the men reported or what the problem was. The foreman recommended adjusting the work schedule to finish the northwest section in morning hours only. The company complied, and the report notes no further problems. I read that 3 times before I moved on. These were men who worked in remote Wisconsin timber in late autumn, sometimes in conditions that present-day workers would walk off the job over. Men who would have known the woods well, and who would not have been easily spooked by wildlife. The idea that an entire evening shift was refusing to work a particular section, and that the foreman's response was to schedule around it rather than discipline them or replace them, is not a small thing. That's a foreman who had looked at whatever the crew was reacting to and decided the pragmatic response was to work around it, not to investigate it, not to dismiss it, not to document it in any way that would get back to management, just to work around it. The report has the quality of a man writing down the minimum necessary to account for a schedule change, while making sure nobody at the company office would ask questions he didn't want to answer. I also found something else in the archive, in a different folder, not related to the logging records. The Eckert family, the family that sold my grandfather the South, 180 acres in 1974, had been on that land since 1921. Carl Eckert's father, Otto, had homesteaded it after the logged-over land was available for agricultural development. There's a brief entry about the Eckert property in a 1958 county extension newsletter about farm improvement projects in the area. The newsletter mentions, as a curiosity, that the Eckert farm had maintained an unusual fencing arrangement on its western boundary for as long as anyone could remember. Double-post construction with extra wire gauge, and that Otto Eckert had explained to his son that the fence was meant to be a clear and visible marker, not a barrier so much as a sign. The newsletter doesn't pursue it beyond that. It's the kind of detail that gets included because it's interesting, not because anyone understood why it mattered, but I understood why it mattered. Otto Eckert knew about the boundary too. He'd built a fence specifically designed to make the line visible and unambiguous, and he'd passed the knowledge to his son, and his son had passed it to Carl, and Carl had sold the land to my grandfather without passing it on, because by the time of the sale, Carl was 70 years old and had just had a serious fall, and was probably thinking about getting out of the county more than he was thinking about the peculiarities of the northwest fence line. My grandfather figured it out on his own, or inherited some version of it from the people who worked the land before him, and he kept the rule for 30 years. When he passed the land to my father, he did pass on the rule in the same stripped-down way it came to me. Stay out of the West Woods after dark. Don't ask why. It's what you do on this land. My father kept it without believing in it. I kept it because I grew up watching my father keep it, and it became habit before I had the context to understand why. That told me the rule went back further than my grandfather. Whatever arrangement Alton Muse maintained when he bought this land in 1961, something about the northwest section of this property had been known about for at least 50 years before that. Probably since the first settlers put fences on this land, and likely before that, among the people who had been in this county before European settlement arrived. There's one more thing from the archive that I want to tell you. It didn't go into my notebook. I sat with it for about 2 weeks before I decided what to do with it. And what I've decided is that it belongs in this account, in the same County Historical Society archive, in a box of donated personal papers from a family called Lindqvist, who farmed the next section east beginning in the 1930s. There is a diary. The diary belongs to Birgit Lindqvist, who came to Barron County from Sweden with her husband Eric in 1931 and farmed that section until Eric's death in 1954 and for several years after. The diary runs from 1931 to about 1958 with some gaps. It's written in Swedish with some English mixed in, the way first-generation immigrants often write in private, the language of thought switching with the subject matter. I can read a little Swedish, enough to get the gist, and I photographed the relevant pages and had them translated by someone I know who grew up speaking it. The relevant entries are from the winter of 1947-1948. Birgit writes about something she calls in Swedish the skogsvakt, which translates roughly as the forest warden or the forest guardian. She uses it as a proper noun, capitalized, the way you'd capitalize a title. She writes that the skogsvakt came to their fence line on 4 occasions that winter, always at dusk or after, and that Eric saw it twice, and she saw it once through the window of the farmhouse. She describes it as very tall, upright, with the head of a hund, a dog. She writes that Eric did not go into the West Timber after the first sighting, and that they had no further trouble. She writes in one entry, which I want to quote because the translation is striking, "The skogsvakt does not come to harm. It comes to be seen. There is a difference. Eric understands this now, and I understand this, and we do not bother the West Timber, and it does not bother us. This is the deal. I do not know who made it first. I think it is very old. I do not know who made it first. I think it is very old. The Lindqvist section is a quarter-mile east of our West Woods. Whatever the skogsvakt was that Birgit wrote about in 1947, it was ranging across multiple properties. Or, there are more of them than I've ever directly seen evidence of on my own land, and the one I know from our West Woods is one of several in this part of Barron County. I don't know which is true. I know that Birgit Lindqvist, a Swedish farm woman with no apparent interest in anything supernatural, who was writing a private diary that she had no reason to perform for anyone, described in 1947 something that matches what I've been seeing on this land in 2021, 2022, and 2023. The physical description, the behavior, the arrangement, the phrase, the deal. She used the same word, and she understood it the same way I understand it. Not as something benevolent, not as something malevolent, but as a structured arrangement that held as long as it was kept. Wade hunted the West Stand for the first time on October 8, 2021, opening weekend of archery season in Wisconsin. He went in before dawn, which meant crossing the tree line in the dark, which was the thing we'd never done on this land in living memory. I knew he was going. I'd asked him one more time to reconsider the week before, sitting at his kitchen table with coffee, and he'd said what he always said when he'd made up his mind. He said he appreciated my concern. He was in the stand by 5:30 in the morning, sat until 11, came out when the morning movement had died down, went back in at 3, sat until dark. He texted me from the field edge when he came out, nothing. Good night though, seeing sign on the bench. Second morning, nothing again. He was frustrated by noon, wondering whether the deer were staging on the bench at all or whether they'd shifted north. He went back in the third afternoon. He called me from the field edge when he came out. His voice was different. "I need to ask you something," he said. "Go ahead. Did you ever see anything in there during the day? Before dark?" I told him I hadn't, which was true. Both of my sightings had been during edge of dark or full dark. I asked him why. He was quiet for a moment. I heard him start walking, boots on frozen ground. "Something came through the ridge," he said. "About 40 minutes before dark, moving north to south along the bench, maybe 50 yards out. Big. Big enough that the deer downwind of me cleared out before it got anywhere near me. 3 does just left, like something hit a switch. I didn't say anything. I didn't get a good look at it," he said. "I heard it, and I smelled it. And then it was gone." He paused. "What does it smell like to you?" "The woods in there." I asked him what he meant. He said the woods had a smell that he couldn't account for. Said he'd noticed it on all 3 trips in. Like old fur and something else underneath. Something he didn't have a word for. Like standing inside something living that didn't want you there. I asked what it had smelled like when the thing moved through the bench. He was quiet a long time. "Warmer," he said finally. Like the regular smell turned up. And close. Even though I never saw it close. He was quiet for another beat, and then he said, "I heard it breathing. I hadn't expected that." I said, "What?" "Just for a second," he said. When it stopped moving for maybe 5 seconds, and I heard it breathing. Low, slow, like it was bigger than anything has a right to be. And then it moved again, and it was gone, but the smell stayed for another hour. The whole bench smelled like it for an hour after it left. I asked him how close he thought it had been when it stopped. He said, 20 yards, maybe less. He said maybe less because the sound of the breathing didn't have any distance in it. He said it sounded like it was right below him, and the stand was at about 16 feet. And there was nothing in the understory between him and the ground that would have blocked line of sight, except the trunk of the maple the stand was in. He said he looked down and saw nothing. Not because it wasn't there. He thinks it was there. He just thinks it wasn't in a place he could see it from that angle. I asked him if he'd had his bow in his hand. He said yes. He said he'd had it in his hand because the 3 does had just left the bench, and he'd had his bow up and was ready, and then they left, and then the smell came, and then the breathing, and at no point did he ever think about using the bow. He said the thought of using the bow didn't occur to him, which was unusual because he was a dedicated hunter, with 20 years of hunting behind him, and drawing on things was his instinct when he had a bow in his hand and something was in range. He said the thought just wasn't there. The impulse was completely absent. He held the bow and listened to the breathing and didn't move. I've thought about what that means. I don't think it was fear that suppressed the impulse. I think it was something more specific. I think whatever it is produces some quality in its presence that interrupts predatory orientation in other species. A function that would make evolutionary sense for a highly intelligent territorial animal that coexists with humans rather than avoiding them. Something that turns off the hunting response before it can generate an action. Dogs do something like it. Horses do it on a smaller scale. But what Wade described was more complete than that. Not a suppression of readiness, but an absence of the relevant drive entirely. He didn't go back to the stand after that. Not that season. He didn't say he was done with it. He just stopped going. He told me the following spring, when he was finally talking about all of it, that on the drive home after the 3rd afternoon, he'd had what he described as a very clear thought. The kind of thought that arrives fully formed without a reasoning process leading to it. The thought was, I'm not going back in there. Not scared, not rattled, not even particularly upset. Just a flat, clear certainty. like the thought had already been decided by something more fundamental than his conscious mind, and was being delivered to him as a conclusion rather than a question. He drove home, he ate dinner, he didn't go back. Winter came in hard that year. January 2022 saw lows around -22 Fahrenheit in Barron County on a Wednesday night that also brought about 14 inches of snow. I was doing winter maintenance on equipment in the shop between livestock chores, getting off the property as little as possible. Wade's farm is 4 miles from mine. He'd bought a small place to the east when we split the land, 80 acres with an older house he'd been fixing up in pieces. We weren't daily in each other's business the way we had been when we shared the farmstead. I'd see him once or twice a week, usually at the co-op or at the equipment dealer in Cumberland. In February, I noticed something in the east pasture. 2 January-born calves were behaving strangely. Not sick strange. I know sick calves. I've raised calves for 30 years. And the early signs of scours or pneumonia are not subtle to someone paying attention. This was different. Both calves were alert, vigorous, but clustered against the south fence as far from the west tree line as they could physically get. Their mothers were calm, chewing cud, unbothered. The calves were standing very close together, their eyes toward the northwest. I walked the pasture that afternoon. The snow was a foot deep in the open. At the northwest corner of the pasture, where the fence meets the tree line of the west woods, there were tracks. I want to be precise about what I measured because precision is the only thing that makes this mean anything. The track was round, roughly 5 inches across at the widest point, with 4 toe impressions and a partial heel pad. No claw marks in front of the toes. That matters because wolves and coyotes in snow almost always show claw impressions. Their nails dig in on soft surfaces. These didn't. The toe pads were clear, the heel was clear, nothing else. Stride length between prints was right around 48 inches, long for anything moving at a walk. And the depth of impression, here's what I kept going back to, was 1.5 inches in snow that should have shown at least 3 to 4 inches under the weight of anything large enough to leave a 5-inch footprint. That ratio doesn't add up for a quadruped. It adds up if the weight is being distributed across 2 contact points with a much larger total surface area, or if the thing is lighter than its size implies, or both. I photographed the tracks, 14 of them along the fence before they turned and entered the woods at a point where the top wire, again, had been pressed outward. I want to stay with the tracks for a minute because I think the specifics matter, and I don't want to let them blur into general strangeness. I went back the next morning with a tape measure and a notepad, and I documented every print I could still read. The snow had crusted overnight, which actually preserved the details better than fresh snow would have. The 5-inch diameter was consistent across all 14 prints, within 1/4 inch on any of them, which tells you the prints were made by one animal, not multiple animals, because individual variation between feet is always smaller than variation between animals. The heel pad in the clearest prints showed a flat contact surface about 2.5 inches across, which is wide for the heel of a bipedal creature. A human heel in snow tends to be narrower and more pointed at the rear. The toe impressions were arranged in a slight arc, not in a straight line across the front of the track the way a canid toe pattern runs. That arc is closer to a primate toe arrangement, which is one of the things that makes these tracks hard to assign to any known species, because the overall shape reads as one thing, and the internal structure reads as another. The stride analysis is the part I keep coming back to. 48 inches, heel to heel, in a walking gait, meaning the prints were alternating left-right in a normal bipedal walking pattern, not the bound pattern of a quadruped. For reference, a 6-foot human with a long walking stride covers about 30 to 34 inches per step. 48 inches would be a walking stride for something in the range of 8 to 9 feet tall, which tracks with the height I'd estimated visually at the fence in July. The pressure depth of 1.5 inches, as I said, tells you the weight per square inch of contact was low for the estimated size. That's either a very light animal, which would be strange for something that size, or an animal distributing its weight across a contact area large enough to reduce pressure. Large, flat-soled feet, with a surface area bigger than what those toe impressions alone would suggest. I have the photographs, I have the measurements in the notebook. I'm not going to post them here, because the moment you put photographs on the internet, you've handed them to people who will spend their time picking them apart, and I'm not interested in that conversation. But they exist, and they say what they say, and what they say is that Something very large and very heavy walked on 2 feet along my west fence line in January 2022 and went back into the west woods. I told Wade about the tracks in March when the slow rhythm of late winter gave us time to sit and talk. His response was quieter than I expected. He asked how big the print was, and I told him, and he nodded in a way that said he'd already been thinking about something similar on his own. Then he told me about the first time it came close to his place. He'd been out to check on a heifer that was close to calving, 1 in the morning, flashlight and his coveralls. His place doesn't border the west woods, he's 4 miles east, but there's a shelter belt on the north side of his property. 3 rows of Norway spruce planted in the 1970s as a windbreak, 60 feet tall now and dense at the base. He was coming back from the calving barn and he stopped walking because something was at the shelter belt. He didn't hear it approach. It was just there, at the north edge, and in the beam of his flashlight, he got a look at it. He said it was big. He said the head was wrong for anything that exists in a biology textbook. He said it looked at him for a long moment. He said the look was the hardest part to explain, that there was something in it that was too present, too specific, like it knew him personally and not just the way an animal knows a smell. And then it was gone. Not turned and ran into the spruce. Gone. The flashlight was on it, and then the flashlight was on. Empty space between the trees and the air where it had been was already cold again. He went inside and sat at his kitchen table with all the lights on until 4 in the morning, he said, then went to bed and didn't sleep. When he told me this in March, sitting at my kitchen table with his coffee going cold beside him, he was very precise about the details in a way that people get when they've been replaying something over and over for months. He said the flashlight was a Streamlight Pro-Tac HL, 300 lumens. He'd had it for 4 years, and he knew the beam quality. He said the beam hit the spruce row at about 40 feet, and whatever was at the north edge was fully illuminated, not dim, not at the edge of the beam, in it. He said the first thing he noticed was the size, not the shape, not the face, the size. The way you notice size before you notice anything else when something is much larger than it should be in a space where you have a calibrated expectation of what normal looks like. The spruce row had 40-foot trees, and the thing at the north edge of it reached to about the first branch layer of the nearest tree, which put it at roughly 8 to 9 feet. That's what he registered first. The size, then the shape. He said the shoulders were wrong. Not wrong in the way that makes you think abnormal animal. Wrong in the way that makes you think different category entirely. The shoulders were high and broad, in a way that implied a chest structure built for something other than horizontal movement, built for something that puts its weight upright and uses those shoulders to drive a different kind of locomotion. He said he'd hunted black bear for 15 years, and he knew what a bear on its hind legs looked like, and this was not that. The weight distribution was different. A bear on its hind legs looks uncomfortable, slightly precarious, built for a posture it's adapting to temporarily. This looked as if upright was its natural configuration, and all of its weight was organized around that assumption. And then the face. He said the face turned toward him when the flashlight hit it, and the turn was slow and deliberate, not the startled snap of a surprised animal. It turned the way you turn when you're already aware someone is there, and you're deciding whether to acknowledge it. He said the face resolved in the beam, and he stood there trying to make it fit any category he had, and it wouldn't fit. And then it was gone, and the gone was as complete as if it had never been there. No sound of movement in the spruce, no cracking of branches. The cold air where it had been was just cold air. I asked him how long the whole encounter lasted. He thought about it. Maybe 12 seconds, he said. Maybe 15. Not long. He said it felt longer at the time because his brain was running very fast, trying to process something it had no file for. It had followed him. 4 miles from the West Woods, to a property it had no historical reason to be on. That's the thing I keep coming back to. Whatever the arrangement was that my grandfather had maintained, whatever the understanding was between this land and what lives in those woods, Wade had been on the wrong side of it since October, and now it was making that clear, not at the farm, at his home. I need to tell you what I believe the arrangement was, because I think most people who encounter things like this don't understand the mechanism. My grandfather didn't avoid the West Woods at night out of superstition. He avoided it because he understood something that my father dismissed and that I relearned the expensive way. The avoidance was a form of acknowledgement, An active recognition of the boundary performed nightly by behavior. You don't enter, I don't come out. The line is real, and it's held in both directions. Not by a lock, but by both parties continuing to treat it as real. What Wade had done by putting a stand in the West Woods was cross that line. Not just trespass, which would already be a violation. He'd entered with weapons and predatory intent. He'd gone into the territory to hunt. That's a completely different thing in the logic of this kind of arrangement. Once one party does that, the other party is no longer bound by the terms either. I want to say something about how I arrived at this understanding, because I didn't come into it with a framework already in place. I built the framework from what I observed, in the same way you build any working model, from evidence and pattern and the minimum explanation that accounts for all the data points. The first thing the evidence required me to accept was that whatever is in the West Woods was paying attention to what Wade did, not to what he intended or what he said or what he thought about afterward. It didn't matter that he hadn't fully understood the rule. It didn't matter that he wasn't acting out of malice. What mattered was the action, which was going into the territory after dark with a weapon and a plan to take something out of it. That action registered, and the response to the action was calibrated to the action, not to the person. That's the part that took me the longest to fully accept. The response was impersonal, in a very specific way. It wasn't anger, it wasn't punishment. It was the correction of an imbalance, the way a scale corrects when you add weight to one side. Not out of feeling, out of mechanics. The arrangement had been violated, and the arrangement required the violating party to understand that it had been violated. That's all. Once Wade understood, genuinely and behaviorally, not just intellectually, the pressure reduced. Not because something forgave him, because the mechanics of the situation had been addressed. The second thing the evidence required me to accept was that the response was deliberate and graduated. It started with the livestock and the cats, which were the lowest level signals, things that might have been coincidence, things that had deniability. When those didn't produce the needed behavior change, the stand coming down, the signals escalated, direct sightings, then his own property, then the yard, then his daughter. Each step was the minimum necessary to produce acknowledgement, nothing more than that. If Wade had pulled the stand after the cattle started clustering in May, I believe nothing else would have happened. The system would have reestablished itself at the minimal level of correction required. That's a very sophisticated behavioral pattern. It implies something that understands proportionality, something that can restrain itself to the minimum effective intervention rather than defaulting to maximum force. You don't get that from instinct. You get that from something that has been managing this kind of situation for a very long time and has learned through experience what works. I think the 6-week delay before anything happened was the thing being patient, testing whether we'd correct it, whether the stand would come down on its own without intervention. When it didn't, the cattle and the cats were the first message. When that didn't produce a result, the sounds at the tree line. When that didn't produce a result, the direct sightings. Each one an escalation in terms of clarity, not in terms of threat. By the time it was standing in Wade's yard at 1 a.m, there was nothing ambiguous left about whether something was paying attention and what it was paying attention to. May of 2022, Wade woke up to something in his yard. He was a light sleeper, always had been, worse since October. And the thing that woke him wasn't a sound from outside. It was the absence of sound. His 2 Australian shepherds had been doing their normal nocturnal routine, clicking across the hardwood and settling. At about 2 a.m, they both stopped entirely. The sudden quality of that silence, the completeness of it, pulled him out of sleep before he'd consciously processed what he was responding to. He looked out his bedroom window, which faces north toward the shelter belt. Nothing visible under the security light. But the 2 dogs were at the foot of his bed, pressed against the baseboard, shaking, not trembling. Shaking, the kind of full-body response that happens when an animal is experiencing something at a frequency you can't hear. He called me at 2:15. I was already half awake. I'd been sleeping lighter myself for a year. He said, "Nate, I think it's in the yard." I drove out. 20 minutes at 80 on roads I know well. By the time I got there, the dogs had calmed some, but wouldn't go near the north side of the house. Wade was at the kitchen table with a 30-06 propped against the counter, which I'd never seen him do inside. We walked the yard at first light. The ground along the north side of the house, below his bedroom window, is packed gravel. No distinct prints in gravel, but the gravel had been disturbed in a strip about 3 feet wide running along the foundation. The small stones moved and resettled in a way that shows where weight has been. The strip ran from the direction of the shelter belt to a point directly below the bedroom window and then back. Stride spacing in the disturbed gravel was about 4 feet, consistent with what I'd measured in the pasture snow in February. Something had walked up from the shelter belt, stood below his window, and walked back. That summer was the hardest of it for Wade. He lost 12 pounds between May and September, which, on a man who's already lean, shows in the face and in the way the clothes hang. He was sleeping badly, 3-4 hours at a stretch, and then wide awake, listening. He left the yard lights on all night, which for a farmer represents a real discomfort, because the electricity habit runs deep in people who grew up watching their parents switch off lights behind them as a kind of religion. But it was more than electricity. It was the admission that you're not comfortable in the dark on your own land, and for someone like Wade, who'd farmed this county his whole life and whose identity was tied up in being a capable, unsentimental person who handled things, that admission cost something. He didn't talk about it much. He'd call me, and we'd talk about field work and equipment and the price of beans, and then he'd go quiet for a moment, and I'd wait, and he'd say something small that wasn't really about what it was about. Said the dogs were acting up again. Said he'd been checking the shelter belt fence and found some posts pressed over that he couldn't account for. Once in July, he called me at 11 at night and said, "I think it was in the cornfield tonight. I could hear the corn moving wrong. I asked wrong how. He said like something big moving through it, slow, not the way deer move through corn, something that was in no hurry. I said, okay, and asked if he was inside, and he said yes, and I said, stay there, and call me if anything changes. And I stayed on the phone with him for 45 minutes until he said the corn had gone quiet, and he thought it was gone, and we said goodnight and hung up. I drove out 3 days after that call, not because he asked me to, but because I wanted to look at the cornfield myself. The corn was at about 10 feet by then, mid-July, full canopy. I walked the north edge, which is where he said the sound had come from, looking at the rows. About 40 yards in from the east end, there was a section where the stalks were bent and in 2 cases broken. Not the way deer push through corn. Deer push with their chests and the stalks spring back. But snapped at about chest height for something tall, the broken ends still green and moist, which meant it had happened within the last few days. The bent stalks showed a passage maybe 3 feet wide, and the passage ran northeast to southwest, cutting across the rows at an angle, which is the direction of the tree line on the north side of his property. I walked back out and didn't say anything to Wade about the broken stalks. He didn't need confirmation. He already knew. In August, his younger daughter Carly, who is 12 and has her father's practical intelligence without any of his stubbornness, told him she'd seen something at the edge of the cornfield at dusk from her bedroom window. He called me about it, and his voice had gone thin and careful. I drove out again. I talked to Carly separately, just us at the kitchen table with the overhead light on, and she told me what she'd seen without decoration. It was standing at the corn edge, she said. It was really tall, and the head wasn't like a dog's head, but it was kind of like a dog's head. And then it was gone, and I watched for a while, but it didn't come back. She thought about it for a moment and added, the corn didn't move when it left. Like, it didn't go into the corn. It just went away. She said she hadn't been scared, and I believed her, which was a different kind of concerning than if she had been scared. She said she hadn't said anything until the next morning because she wasn't sure Wade would believe her. That was the part that hit Wade the hardest, not the sighting, not even that his daughter had seen it. The fact that she'd looked at it for 10 seconds and gone to bed without telling him because she thought he'd dismiss it. He sat with that for a long time at the kitchen table after Carly had gone to her room. And I sat with him, and neither of us said anything for a while. He asked me what to do, and it was the first time he'd ever asked me that directly, without the hedge or the resistance. The first time in our whole lives that I can remember him asking me what to do and meaning it. I told him the truth as best I understand it. I told him the arrangement was what it was, and that it had to be earned back through sustained behavior over time, the same way it had been lost through behavior over time. I told him the visits to his property, the shelter belt, the tracks, the yard, his daughter at the corn edge, were pressure, not escalation toward violence. That if something that size and with that capability had wanted to do damage, it could have done it already, and it hadn't. What it was doing was making itself impossible to ignore, leaving signs that couldn't be rationalized, narrowing the distance until there was no comfortable explanation left. That's a different thing than an attack. That's a demand for acknowledgement. I told him he needed to pull the stand, not just stop hunting it, pull it. Remove the physical object from the woods, because the stand was the artifact of the violation, and leaving it standing in the tree was the same as leaving a marker there that said he intended to return. And I told him he needed to stop carrying the rifle when he went out at night to check livestock. I said this carefully because I know Wade and I didn't want him to hear it as an instruction to be defenseless. I said the rifle was the wrong tool here, not because of any physical danger, but because the rifle was the same energy as the deer stand. The hunting energy, the taking energy, and bringing it into the yard at night was the same as continuing to signal that he was a predator in that dynamic, when what he needed to signal was that he understood the boundary and was keeping it. He looked at me for a long time across his kitchen table. Then he said, "Okay." He meant it this time. He pulled the stand in April. We went in together on a Wednesday afternoon, full light, temperatures in the low 40s with some cloud but no wind. One of those April days in Wisconsin that can't decide whether it's still winter. We took the platform down and carried it out in pieces and loaded it in the truck. And I want to tell you what that felt like because I think it matters to the story. Going into the West Woods in daylight is different from crossing the tree line in the dark, but it's not nothing. The woods are dense, and it was April, mud season, and the birch trees still didn't have leaves yet, but the understory was starting to green up, and the ground was soft and dark and printed everywhere with the tracks of the animals that had been moving through all winter. Deer tracks, rabbit, what looked like Fisher moving northeast along the creek drainage. The bench where Wade had placed the stand had a worn oval of deer sign around it. Scrapes, tracks, rubs on the maples at the edges where bucks had worked the bark and fall. And the stand itself was dry and looked like nothing had touched it since October. The platform was solid, well built, which was characteristic of how Wade did things. We dismantled it without talking much. The bolts came out clean. The climbing sticks came off the tree one by one, and we laid them in the snow at the base of the maple. The platform came down in 2 sections. I carried the heavier section, and Wade carried the climbing sticks, and we walked back out toward the field edge without speaking. I kept my attention divided between the work and the forest around us the whole time we were in there. I didn't see anything. I didn't hear anything, except the creek running over the gravel in the low section to the north, and the wind moving through the last dead leaves still clinging to the oaks in the upland areas. The forest had the quality forests have in early spring, before the leaves come in. Open and gray and quieter than summer, the kind of quiet where you can hear your own footsteps on the frozen crust of the snow. And it sounds loud. I want to tell you what the West Woods looked like from the inside in April 2022, because it's the most sustained time I've spent on the west side of the fence, and I think the description matters for anyone trying to understand what kind of place this is. The upland section, the first 300 yards and from the fence line, was sugar maple and yellow birch mixed with some basswood, the trees running to 18 to 24 inches diameter, old growth that hadn't been cut in at least 60 years by the look of the bark. The trunks were clean and gray in the early spring light, the canopy still bare, and the forest floor under them was a thick layer of leaf litter from last fall that crunched underfoot until you got to the wet spots where the litter had composted into a soft, dark mat that gave under your boots. There were deer tracks everywhere in the soft ground at the wet spots, heavily used, and the rubs on the maples at the bench perimeter were serious. Bark stripped a foot wide and 4 inches deep in places, the kind of work a genuinely large buck does when it's serious about marking. The bench itself was a different texture than the upland. The soil was different, darker, heavier, clay content higher than the sandy glacial till above it. It held moisture differently, and the ground was softer there, even in late April, and the trees growing on it were bigger, the maples wider through the chest than anywhere else in the woodlot. Standing on the bench and looking north, you could see down into the tamarack zone, where the ground dropped toward the wetland. And even without leaves, the tamaracks were visible by their growth pattern, shorter and more open than the upland hardwoods, and through them, the glint of standing water. The smell in the West Woods in April was exactly what I'd been smelling from the fence line my whole life, but concentrated. The muskeg smell from the wetland mixed with the dead leaf smell from the upland, and underneath both of those the thing I'd never been able to name. The old organic smell that wasn't fungal and wasn't decay and wasn't anything with a category. In the interior, away from the fence, it was stronger, not overwhelming, not unpleasant, Just present, the way some old houses have a smell that tells you the house has a long history and the history is in the walls. But I'll tell you what I did feel, because I think it's relevant and I want to be honest about the whole record. At the twin trunk maple where the stand had been, while I was helping Wade get the last bolts out of the upper mounting points, I felt watched. Not scared, watched. The back of my neck, the specific feeling. And it didn't feel hostile. It felt like what I'd come to understand as the usual quality of the West Woods when something was present and paying attention. That compression. That sense of being under a gaze that was calm and patient and thorough. I didn't say anything to Wade about it. I just worked faster and got us out. When we came out of the tree line with the last pieces in our arms and our boots hit the stubble of the east field, I felt something release in my chest that I hadn't realized I'd been holding since October. Wade didn't say anything about it. He just put the climbing sticks in the truck bed and shut the tailgate and stood there for a moment looking at the tree line. He said, "What now?" I said, "We wait. We hold the line and we wait." He nodded. We drove the truck back to the farmstead and unloaded the stand in the equipment shed, and that was that. Wade held the corrected behavior. He went out every night that fall without the rifle, and he gave the shelter belt a wide berth, and he let the yard light issue go, let himself sit in the discomfort of it. He started bringing the dogs inside earlier in the evening, getting them settled before full dark, which helped with their anxiety and his. Winter of 2022 was different at his place. The dogs still had occasional restless nights, but nothing like the sustained pressure of summer and fall. Wade slept better. The weight came back on over Christmas and into January. He started sounding more like himself on the phone. But I want to tell you about the worst night of it, which was actually in November of 2022, after the stand had been out for 7 months, and after Wade had been holding the corrected behavior for the better part of a year. Because I think people who hear this account might assume the correction worked cleanly and quickly, and I want to be honest that it didn't. November 4th, 2022. I know the date because I wrote it in the notebook that night and circled it. Wade called me at midnight. Not 2 in the morning, not 1, midnight, which meant he hadn't been asleep at all. He was crying, not sobbing, not losing it, but his voice had a quality that I'd heard maybe twice in our whole lives, and only in situations where something very bad had happened. He sounded like a man at the end of something. He said he'd been sitting on his front porch at about 10:30, which he did sometimes, just sitting in the dark with a beer, something he'd done his whole life without a second thought. He said he was sitting there, and he became aware that the shelter belt was not empty. He didn't see anything. He didn't hear anything. He just knew, the way you know when a room behind you has someone in it even when you haven't looked. And he said the knowing had a quality to it that was different from the previous times, because the previous times, the knowing had arrived as information, and this time, it arrived as something else, something he described as a weight. He said it felt like being looked at by something very old and very tired, something that had been watching a long time and was still watching and would keep watching, and the weight of that, not the threat of it, just the weight of the accumulated age of it, had put him on the floor of his porch. He said he sat down on the porch boards because his legs went and he couldn't get back up for about 20 minutes. He just sat there on the floor of his own porch in November and looked at the shelter belt and whatever was in it looked back at him. And it wasn't trying to hurt him, and it wasn't leaving. And the encounter lasted until about 11:45. And then the quality changed, and he could tell it had moved off, and he went inside and called me. I drove out. I didn't ask questions on the phone. I just said, "I'm coming," and I got in the truck and I drove out. By the time I got there, he was at his kitchen table, and he was okay, meaning functional, meaning not in crisis. But the expression on his face was one I hadn't seen before, and haven't seen since. The expression of a man who has finally completely understood something that he had been resisting understanding for a year and a half. He said, "It's never going away, is it?" I said, "It was here before your grandfather bought this land, and it'll be here after we're both dead. That's not a threat, it's just what it is." He said, "And the deal is real." I said, "Yes, the deal is real." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I wish Dad had told us more." I said, "I think Dad didn't know more. I think the rule is what got passed down and the reason behind it got lost a long time ago." I said, "I thought Alton knew more, but that Alton also probably understood that knowing the reason wasn't strictly necessary if the behavior was right." We sat there for a while, and I made coffee, and we drank it, and by about 2:30, he was okay to go to bed, and I drove home. He never had another night like that. Whatever happened on his porch on November 4th was the last escalation, the final pressure, the last communication that needed to be sent. After that, the quality of his situation changed. Not gone, but different. The presence in the shelter belt settled into something that felt, and he described this to me once carefully, as if he wasn't sure he had the right words. Like an acknowledgement. Like something had registered that he knew, that he understood. And that was enough. In the weeks after November 4th, Wade did something that I think was the right response, even though he arrived at it independently, and I didn't suggest it. He started taking care of the west fence on our shared property, not because he needed to. That fence is on my half. It's my responsibility. But because he wanted to do something physical that expressed the maintenance of the boundary. He'd come over 2 or 3 times a month and walk a section of the west fence with me, and we'd check wire tension and staple hold and post lean, and we'd repair whatever needed repairing. He didn't talk about why he was doing it, and I didn't ask. He just showed up and worked the fence. There's something in that I think is important. The arrangement is maintained through behavior, and behavior is the only language it responds to. Wade had spent a year and a half behaving one way, first crossing the line, then not crossing it, but not yet signaling the understanding clearly enough. And on November 4th, something in the shelter belt had come and stood in the dark and let him feel the full weight of what he was dealing with. And after that, he understood what the behavior needed to be. Not just refraining from the violation, but actively maintaining the boundary, tending the fence line the way you tend anything that matters. Doing it consistently, doing it in the right spirit, and doing it without needing it explained every time. He and I have had some long conversations in the years since about what we think this arrangement is. Not what it means in a cosmic sense. Neither of us has the framework for that, and I'm not sure the framework exists. But what the mechanics of it are. How it works. Wade's theory, which I think has merit, is that the arrangement is essentially ecological. That whatever is in the West Woods is a territorial animal that has been on this land for a very long time. Long enough to have developed through generations what functions as learned behavior toward the humans it coexists with on the boundary, that the rule, stay out after dark, don't hunt the territory, is the product of a long history of what happened when people kept it versus when they didn't, filtered down through the human chain in the form of the transmitted rule. Alton knew the rule, but not the full history. His grandfather probably knew more. The people who were on this land before European settlement probably had the full understanding, going back to whatever the original establishment of the arrangement was. My theory, which is compatible with Wade's but adds something, is that whatever is in the West Woods is intelligent in a way that's not fully analogous to animal intelligence as we understand it. The behavioral evidence I've accumulated points toward a cognitive capacity that includes long-term memory of specific individuals, spatial reasoning about human movement patterns and property boundaries, deliberate management of encounter intensity and timing, and something that functions like strategic patience. The ability to hold back and observe before escalating, to calibrate the response to the behavior rather than reacting instinctively. I don't know what kind of brain produces those capacities. I don't know if there's a neurological model for it in any existing taxonomy. I just know what the behavior looks like. And what it looks like is not what I'd expect from any animal I know about. Let me tell you about the third time I saw it, because I think it's the most important of the 4 encounters in terms of what it told me about what this thing actually is. It was October 2022, almost exactly a year after Wade had hunted the stand. I was checking the south fence in the late afternoon, the light already going flat and gray because we were past the equinox, and the sun was low by 4:30. I'd been out for about an hour, and I was working my way back north along the fence line toward the barnyard, and I was close enough to the farmstead that I was still inside what felt like reasonable time. It was standing at the fence, not in the tree line this time, at the fence, the west side of the fence, which put it about 10 feet from me across the wire, and it was not partially concealed by anything. It was standing in the open, in full late afternoon visibility, and it was looking at me. I stopped walking. The staple hammer was in my hand, and I was aware of it in the way you're aware of something that you understand won't help you. My heart rate went up, but my thinking stayed clear, which I've noticed about all of these encounters. The fear is there, but it doesn't swamp the processing. I think that's because it isn't a predatory confrontation. It has never felt like a predatory confrontation. Close at 10 feet, I could see it in detail I hadn't had before. The fur was very dark, nearly black at the back and the legs, slightly lighter at the chest, and there was a quality to the texture of it. The individual hairs visible at the chest where the fur was shorter, that read as animal and wrong at the same time, in the way that something built for a body you've never seen before looks unfamiliar even in the parts you think you recognize. The face had a length to it that is genuinely outside what normal canid proportions produce, even in the largest wolf on record. A timber wolf, which Wisconsin has a documented population of in the northern counties, has a head length of maybe 12 to 14 inches from the back of the skull to the tip of the muzzle. What I was looking at was longer than that, proportionally, and the muzzle was not a wolf's muzzle. A wolf's muzzle is broad at the base and tapers toward the nose. This was narrow, almost tubular, and the jaw was deeper than a wolf's jaw at the hinge, the way a dog's jaw gets deeper when you scale up a skull beyond what the breed was designed for. The nostrils were wide and mobile, and it was actively scenting me, not in an aggressive way. In the way a dog noses something it wants to understand. The ears were high and forward, and both of them were oriented directly at me, the interior of each ear angled forward, and I was aware that every sound I was making was being attended to with a specificity and clarity that I couldn't match. The eyes were amber-colored in that light, not the yellow I'd seen at distance in the first encounter, and they had the quality I'd tried to describe before. They were looking at me rather than monitoring me. There's a difference. You can feel the difference. An animal monitors. It takes in information about your position, your movement, whether you're a threat or prey or neither, and it processes that information in service of a behavioral response. This was looking at me in the way a person looks at another person when they want the person to understand something. The attention in it was directed not at my body, but at something it understood to be behind my body. We stood like that for probably 20 seconds, the longest of the 4 encounters by far, and then it looked down at the top strand of fence between us, a deliberate, directed look, not a random movement of its gaze. It looked at the wire, and then it looked back at me. I understood that as clearly as if it had spoken. The line, here's the line. We're both here at the line, and that's where this is. Then it stepped back into the shadows at the tree line, without a sound, without the sound of movement in the leaves or the brush that something that size should produce when it moves through terrain that dense. Just gone. I walked back to the farmstead and wrote it all down. I've done that after every encounter, same notebook, same level of detail, and reading back through the entries. Now, the thing that strikes me is how consistent the quality of the encounters has been. Every one of them has had that same directed attention, that same quality of deliberateness, the sense of something acting with intention and expecting the intention to be received. Not as communication exactly, not as language, more like the way 2 neighboring landowners acknowledge each other at a fence line. You're here, I'm here. This is the line between us. We both know it's there. The 4th encounter was October 2023, almost exactly a year later. Tree line again at the west fence. Same configuration as the first. It at the tree line, me at the fence, late afternoon. About 5 seconds of direct observation. Then it left. I've started to think of these as check-ins. Maybe that's projection. But the regularity of it, the consistency of the location and the timing and the nature of what happens, not aggressive, not casual, something deliberate, suggests a behavioral pattern that is more like maintenance than chance. It's checking whether the arrangement is still in place. I'm the same farmer at the same fence in the same position I've been in for 40 years. The answer is yes, the arrangement is still in place, and the encounter ends. Same as it's ended every time since 2021, except for the period when Wade had the stand-in and something went wrong with the dynamic and the encounter stopped being check-ins and started being pressure. I want to say something about what I think these things are, biologically, before I get into the framework I've found most useful for understanding the behavior, because I think the biology question and the framework question are separate and both matter. On the biology, I've read everything I can find on unclassified large predator reports in the Great Lakes region. There's more documentation than most people realize, mostly in county-level records, wildlife conflict reports, DNR incident filings that go back to the 1970s. What the reports describe, when they're detailed enough to analyze, is consistent across a wide geographic range and a long time span. Upright locomotion in an animal with clearly canid cranial features. Reported heights consistently in the 7 to 8 foot range when fully upright. Weight estimated from track depth and stride pattern in the range of 400 to 600 pounds. Distribution concentrated in the mixed hardwood forest zone of the upper Midwest and Great Lakes, with reported sightings thinning dramatically east of the Mississippi in the lower Midwest and increasing again in the Appalachian hardwood zone. What that distribution suggests is a forest interior species with a preference for specific habitat types, mixed hardwood with wetland access specifically. The combination of upland forest and accessible water is exactly what the west half of this property offers, and it's characteristic of a large swath of north-central Wisconsin and the upper peninsula of Michigan, which is where the density of reports is highest. The Wisconsin DNR wolf population tracking data shows consistent gaps in documented wolf territory in Barron County in areas that overlap with the highest density of Dogman report clusters. I don't know what to do with that, except note it. Either the wolf population data has holes in it, or wolves avoid the areas where these things operate. The second explanation is biologically plausible. Apex predators and competing territorial species do avoid each other's core ranges. The behavioral evidence I've accumulated from my own encounters and from the historical record points towards something territorial and cognitively sophisticated. The pressed fence wire rather than broken wire suggests an understanding that breaking would communicate differently than pressing. The seasonal timing of the check-in encounters, consistently in October, consistently at dusk, suggests a behavioral calendar, a routine that has to do with marking or maintaining something at a specific time of year. October is when deer hunting season opens in Wisconsin. The timing may not be coincidental. An intelligent territorial animal would have reason to intensify boundary monitoring at the time of year when armed humans start moving through wooded areas. The tracking of Wade to his property 4 miles away and the selection of his shelter belt as the approach point, that's either an intelligence that can map human movement patterns, or a biological mechanism for tracking specific individual scent signatures over distance, or both. I lean toward both. Wolves track individual prey animals over miles by scent and maintain individual recognition within their territory. Scale that cognitive capacity up with the additional factor of human-environment interaction over a very long period, and you get something that can identify a specific person, know where they live, and decide to go there. The thing about the fourth encounter that I want to tell you before I describe it is the context, which is that by October 2023, I'd been maintaining the rule for over 40 years, and I'd had 3 direct encounters with whatever is in the West Woods, and I'd spent the previous 2 years helping Wade navigate the consequences of having broken the arrangement and then correcting it. I was not afraid of the West Fence Line in October 2023. I was something else, alert, attentive, respectful in the way you'd be respectful of something powerful that you had an established relationship with. Not comfortable exactly. Respectful. The fourth encounter was October 2023, almost exactly a year later. Tree line again at the west fence. Same configuration as the first. It at the tree line, me at the fence, late afternoon. About 5 seconds of direct observation. Then it left. What was different about the fourth encounter from the first 3 is hard to describe, but it was real. The quality of the attention was different. The first encounter had an assessment quality to it. Something working out what I was and what I was doing at the fence. The second encounter had a monitoring quality, something tracking whether the situation was going to be corrected. The third encounter had a deliberateness, a purposiveness, the look at the fence wire that communicated the terms. The fourth encounter had none of those qualities. It had the quality of something checking a thing it already knows, a confirmation rather than an investigation. I was at the fence, it came to the tree line. It saw I was there. It left. 5 seconds. That was all it needed. I've started to think of these as check-ins. Maybe that's projection, but the regularity of it, the consistency of the location and the timing and the nature of what happens, not aggressive, not casual, something deliberate, suggests a behavioral pattern that is more like maintenance than chance. It's checking whether the arrangement is still in place. I'm the same farmer at the same fence in the same position I've been in for 40 years. The answer is yes, the arrangement is still in place, and the encounter ends. Same as it's ended every time since 2021, except for the period when Wade had the stand-in and something went wrong with the dynamic and the encounters stopped being check-ins and started being pressure. I expect a fifth encounter in October 2024. I'll be at the west fence line at dusk, doing what I always do, and it will come to the tree line, and we'll acknowledge each other, and it will leave. That's the rhythm now. That's the arrangement as it stands. What I think the Book of Enoch is actually saying about these things. Not the theological reading, but the practical one, which is the most useful frame I've found, is that the Watchers are described as entities with a specific function. Observation, boundary maintenance, the holding of a line between what humans can know and what they're not equipped for. They're not described as hostile except when their domain is violated. They're not described as benevolent either. They're described as occupying a role in a structure that predates human society and isn't organized around human categories of good and evil. That's what I see in the West Woods. Something that is in its place doing what it does, which is watch and maintain a boundary, and that has made an arrangement with the people on this land that is as old as the land has been worked, and that treats violation of the arrangement as an act requiring a response, and that treats sustained correct behavior as sufficient over time to reestablish the terms. That's not supernatural in the way most people use that word. That's a system. It has rules. The rules are consistent. The consequences for breaking them are proportional. You can work with rules if you understand them. I'll say one more thing about the cultural framework before I leave it, because I think it matters for the question of whether any of this can be taken seriously by people who haven't experienced it. The phenomenon of a forest guardian entity operating under a boundary arrangement with local human populations isn't unique to any one culture or geography. It shows up in Finnish folklore, the metsenhaltija, the forest holder, whose territory was to be respected and who required acknowledgement before you entered the deep woods. It shows up in Slavic traditions, the leshy, the forest spirit, territorial and dangerous when provoked, capable of leading you astray, but also capable of arrangement and pact. It shows up in Japanese tradition, the tengu, the mountain guardians, depicted with hybrid human-animal features, associated with specific places that required specific behaviors from those who entered. It shows up in Germanic forest tradition as the Waldschrat, the wild man of the woods, with whom certain households maintained relationships by respecting the forest boundary. Not one of these traditions emerged from contact with any of the others. They developed independently in different parts of the world over different time periods in different linguistic and cultural contexts, and they all describe the same functional entity, something large, something old, something with mixed human and animal characteristics, something territorial, something that responds to boundary violations with graduated pressure, something with which an arrangement can be maintained if the arrangement is kept. The consistency across traditions that had no contact with each other is the strongest argument I know for treating this as a real phenomenon rather than mythology. Mythology borrows and spreads. Independent convergence is harder to explain away. I'm not asking you to believe in folklore. I'm asking you to consider what it means when dozens of unconnected human cultures, across thousands of years, all arrived at the same description of something they were dealing with in the forest. My grandfather understood them. I understand them. Wade understands them now, the hard way. There is one last thing I want to say about all of this. Not about the thing in the West Woods, but about the cost of what I'm describing, because I think people deserve to understand what maintaining this kind of arrangement actually involves. Keeping the rule means there's a section of this property that I manage but don't use. The timber in the West Woods would be worth something. The bench where Wade put his stand has deer traffic that would make any hunter's season if he sat on it, and I don't sit on it, and I won't. The Northwest wetland probably holds waterfowl I ignore. Every year there's something in the West, half that I look at from the field edge and think, that's worth something, and then I don't do anything about it. Over 20-some years of owning the property, that adds up. Not to something I can calculate exactly, but to something real. There are also things I'm more careful about than I would otherwise be. I don't let contractors or hired help work on the west fence line in the evenings. I don't let Wade's daughters play in the east pasture after 4:30 in winter when dark comes early. I'm home before sundown on most days in a way that, if you asked me to justify it in pure economic terms, I couldn't fully. I've turned down a timber sale that would have been good money because the cutting schedule would have required work in the West Woods into late afternoon in November. The logging company didn't understand why I wouldn't do it, and I didn't explain. I just said the timing didn't work and let it go. The cost of the rule is real, it's ongoing, it doesn't go away, and I want to be honest about something else that costs, which is harder to talk about than the economics. The rule reshapes how you inhabit the land. Not in a way that's crippling, not in a way that makes the farm unworkable, but in a way that's constant and specific. There are moments I don't get to have, experiences I don't get to have, because of what I know about the west side of this property. I don't watch sunsets from the west fence anymore. I used to. When I was younger, before I understood any of this at a conscious level, I'd sometimes walk out to the west fence at the end of a day, in June or July, and lean on a post and watch the light go down over the tree line, the way the last light comes through the birches and hits the corn in a certain slant that's specific to that hour. I don't do that anymore. Not because something bad happens when I do, because I'm aware of what's on the other side of that tree line, and standing at the fence at dusk feels like standing at a threshold I'm supposed to approach with intention rather than casualness. You don't lean on the church door. I don't take the west fence at night, which seems obvious given the rule, but means more in practice than it sounds. Fencing problems don't care what time it is. A heifer can go through a fence at 11 at night, and you find it in the morning, and the fence went down 3 hours ago. On the east side, the south side, the north side, I deal with those repairs in darkness if I have to. On the west fence, I wait until morning, regardless of what the fence condition is. I've had wire down overnight that cost me some minor livestock inconvenience and some lost sleep. That's the cost. I think about who I'm going to leave this to. I don't have kids of my own. Wade has 2 daughters, and the older one, Marta, who is 17, has been coming out to the farm on weekends for the last 2 years, learning equipment and field management in the way that farm kids do when they're deciding whether farming is what they want. She's sharp, and she's serious, and she has her father's practical eye for systems. I've been trying to figure out the right time and the right way to tell her about the rule. Not because it has to happen soon. She's 17, she's not making land decisions. But because I've thought a lot about Alton not telling my father fully, about the information getting thinned by each transmission. And I don't want to be the generation that thins it again. What I've decided is that when the time is right, I'm going to show her the notebook, all of it. From the first July entry to the most recent October. I'm going to tell her what I've told you here, the whole record, not the stripped-down version my grandfather passed to my father. And I'm going to take her to the west fence line on a May afternoon, and I'm going to show her Otto Eckert's double-post construction and explain what it meant, and I'm going to ask her to feel what she feels standing at that fence line and tell me what she notices. Because I think people who spend time on this land develop a sensitivity to it that I can't fully teach. I can give her the information, but the relationship with this particular piece of ground is something she'll have to build herself, the way I built it, the way Alton built it. I just want her to know what she's building toward, but so is what I'd lose if I stopped keeping it, and so is what Wade lost, and is still in the process of recovering from when he stopped. I want to be honest about where Wade is now, because I think it's important. He's better. The pressure backed off when he corrected the behavior and held the correction, and he's sleeping through the night most of the time, and the dogs are calmer, and Carly hasn't said anything about the corn edge since that August 2 years ago. But it's not clean. He told me last fall that he still doesn't feel easy in the shelter belt at night, that something about the north side of his property holds a weight it didn't have before October 2021. He said he thinks that's just him now. The kind of knowledge that reshapes how you're present in a place, not because the danger is active, but because you know what can happen in a place like that when someone decides the rules don't apply to them. I think that's probably right. Some things you don't get back to before. You get to a stable new version of before, which is different. There's a specific conversation we had in the spring of this year that I want to include here because I think it captures something true about where we both are now. We were walking the west fence together, doing the May maintenance, and we were at the south end of the line where the fence meets the corner post at the edge of the west woods. Wade was working a staple that had backed out, and I was holding the wire tension with the fence stretcher, and neither of us was saying anything. And then Wade said, out of nowhere, "Do you think it knows we're talking about it?" I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Like when you talk about it to other people. When you tell the story, do you think it knows?" I said, "I didn't know." I said, "I thought whatever awareness it had was probably local, tied to the territory, not broadcast." I said I thought what it knew about was what happened at the fence line and what happened in the woods, and what happened elsewhere was probably outside what it tracked. He was quiet for a while, working the staple back in. Then he said, "I don't think that's right. I think it knows more than you're giving it credit for. I think that's the thing you have to understand about it. The range of what it knows is bigger than you think." I didn't argue with him. He's spent 2 years being the subject of its attention in a way I haven't, and I think his read on the scope of its awareness might be more accurate than mine. I notice things at the fence line, and I see it once a year in October. He felt it at his home, 4 miles from the West Woods, for the better part of 2 years. He has a different sample size. What I do know is that whatever it knows, the rule holds. Whatever the range of its awareness is, the rule holds. And that's what I have to work with. My grandfather understood something about this land that most people don't have the context to understand anymore, because most people don't live on the same land for generations, don't know the stories that go back past their own memory, don't have reason to notice that certain things are consistent across a very long time. He kept the rule, and the land was good to him. His crops didn't fail in the years that were hard for everyone else around him, in ways I can't explain by soil quality or drainage or seed selection alone. I don't know what to do with that, whether it means anything beyond coincidence. But I notice it. I've started paying attention in the last few years to the condition of the West Woods in the way I never paid attention before, because I've come to think the condition of the West Woods tells me something about whether the arrangement is healthy, when the arrangement is intact, when the rule is being kept, when the check-ins are happening on schedule, when the dynamic is what it should be. The West Woods do a specific thing. The frogs come back in May. The ravens move through in fall. In winter, the deer use the West Woods as a bedding area, the way they should in heavy snow. And when you walk the east fence line, you can see their tracks going in and coming back out. The West Woods produce, not for us, but for themselves. The ecosystem functions. When the arrangement was breaking down, in 2021 and 2022, the West Woods went quiet in a different way than they'd been quiet before. The frogs stopped. The track patterns on the snow changed. Even the timber itself seemed to change. I noticed that a section of mature maple in the northwest corner, trees I'd watched for 30 years, had a higher percentage of dead canopy in the summer of 2022 than I'd ever seen. The crown dieback in those trees could have been drought stress or emerald ash borer pressure on adjacent trees or any number of things. But it was there, and it was new, and I noticed it. By 2023, the canopy in the northwest corner was recovering. The frogs were back at the wetland. The ravens were through in October. I noticed those things. I don't know what they mean. I just notice them. And I keep the rule, and I wait for the October check-in at the west fence, and so far the arrangement holds. I'm going to keep the rule until I'm not farming the land anymore, and I intend to make sure the next person who farms it knows about it before they get comfortable making their own decisions about the West Woods. I'm going to write it down in the farm records alongside the tile drain map, and the field histories and the equipment maintenance log, in plain language that doesn't require any particular belief system to understand. The rule is what it is, the West Woods are what they are, and this is what you do. I think about the Lindqvist diary entry sometimes. Birgit writing in the winter of 1947, in Swedish mixed with English, about the Skogsvakt. I do not know who made it first. I think it is very old. She didn't know who had established the arrangement. She'd just received it the way we all receive things like this, through proximity, through observation, through a slow accumulation of encounters that forced understanding. She'd figured it out the same way Alton figured it out, the same way I figured it out. And she'd passed it to her husband, and they'd kept it. And then the farm sold, and whoever came after probably didn't know. And if there was a period when things on the Lindqvist section went wrong, it's not in any record I found. That gap in the record is the thing I think about. How many times has this arrangement been lost and found? Lost and found. Across the generations of people who have worked this particular piece of ground, how many times has someone done what Wade did, decided the old habit didn't apply to them, went into the West Woods, encountered the pressure, corrected the behavior, and then sold the farm without passing on what they'd learned, so the next person had to figure it out again from scratch? How many Rolf Karjalas have sold and moved rather than stay and learn? How many Otto Eckerts have quietly built their double-post fence on the western boundary and not explained why to anyone who wasn't already paying attention? The arrangement is old enough that it survived all of that. The thing in the West Woods was here before Alton Mews, and before Otto Eckert, and before the logging crews of 1909, and before the European settlement of Barron County. It was here when the Ojibwe were the only people in this part of Wisconsin, and it will be here after I'm gone, in whatever the West Woods become. And it will do what it has always done, which is watch the boundary and maintain the arrangement with whoever happens to be on this side of it at any given time. What I'm doing by writing this down, by saying it on a platform that has some permanence, is trying to make the transmission more reliable. Not because I think everyone who hears this has land that works like mine. Most people don't, but some of them do or will or know someone who does. And for those people, the information matters. Not as horror, not as entertainment, though I understand that's how most of this is going to be received, and I can't control that. As information, the kind of information that every generation of people on this land has had to assemble painfully from scratch, because nobody before them wrote it down in a way that traveled. My grandfather didn't write the rule down. My father didn't write the rule down. I'm writing it down. I'm saying it out loud. Not for most people who hear this. For the person who's going to farm this land after me, and the person after that, and whoever might be sitting on land somewhere in the upper Midwest, or the Pacific Northwest, or the hill country of Tennessee, somewhere with old mixed hardwood forest and a back 40 that nobody goes into at night, who has heard some version of a rule from their grandparent and isn't sure whether to treat it as superstition or as information. It's information. Keep it. Nothing into the West Woods after dark. Nothing crosses that fence line once the sun goes down. And in exchange, nothing comes out. The deal holds as long as someone holds it. So far, someone always has. I'll be at the west fence in October, same as always. And something will come to the tree line and look at me and register that, yes, the arrangement is intact, and go back into the woods. And I'll walk home and put the staple hammer in the shop and wash my hands at the utility sink and make coffee and sit at the kitchen table the same as I have 1,000 times. And the West Woods will be there, the way they've always been there, dark and full and doing what they do. The creek running through them, the deer bedding on the bench where Wade's stand used to be. The wetland in the northwest corner, coming alive, in May the way it does, the frogs back, the ravens through in October, the tamaracks going gold in early November before the snow. All of it running on a schedule I didn't make and couldn't change and don't need to understand completely. It's enough to know the shape of it. That's enough. That's all I need it to be.